You're listening to the Manifesto Press podcast. You're listening to the Manifesto Press podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the second Manifesto Press Coup podcast. This is where all socialist activists get their inspiration, their enlightenment and information better than Good Morning Britain, better than Jonathan Ross. So thank you very much for tuning in. First of all, I want to introduce myself. I'm Nigel Flanagan. I'm a long-standing trade union activist and organizer. Been working in the Northwest currently, previously worked in many places around the world, including Africa, Palestine, Asia, and other many far-flung places. What we're going to do today is I'm going to be talking to the exceptional, the brilliant Bill Katz about his new book about the life of Tom Mann. An amazing piece of work, which I can't wait to discuss with him. I'm also the author of this less amazing piece of work, Our Trade Unions, What Next After 2022. And hopefully Phil will give me the opportunity to try and make the book sound better than it actually is. So thank you once again. If you would like to follow us on Twitter, we have a Twitter account at Manifesto lowercase press, and log on, follow us. Keep in touch with us. Let us know what you think. Suggestions for future topics, anything, very, very welcome. Thank you very much for allowing that introduction. So next, I'm going to introduce Phil. If you don't know Phil already, Phil is a long-standing rank and file activist, union organizer, political strategist, a comrade who's worked around the world, in Australia, in South Africa, in Ireland, as well as in the UK, with a background in the printing industry, and the author of 4 other books, all of which can be found on manifestopress.coop. So if you get a chance, look Phil up, look up his other work, but I'm here to talk to him about his latest book. And welcome, Phil. Thanks for coming along.
Well, thanks for saying such nice things about me. I've got a little bit to live up to now, haven't I?
You certainly have, and I haven't mentioned to anybody about Spurs supporting background or anything like that. So we're off to a good start.
Probably the less said about that, the better.
Of course, yeah. But I want to start off by asking you a really basic, straightforward question, because I loved the book and I found it really inspiring. But I want to ask you, why Tom Mann?
When I first came into the Labour movement, I was mentored by 2 people, one called Ted Roycroft, who was an engineer on the North London District Committee of the Engineering Union, had been a machine gunner in the International Brigades, shared a flat with Christopher Caldwell, and Jack Tapsell, who was also on the same committee, was an organiser in the engineering industry. And they both had known Tom Mann. They were obviously, when I met them, they were in their 60s, but in their youth, they'd been around Tom Mann. And they described him as this sort of semi-mythical character that hovered above the movement. And the more that I dug for my book, I found that he wasn't so hovering and was actually very much involved as a kind of go-to person who carried with him and probably personified the history of the movement for the previous 70 odd years. So yeah, I became fascinated by him. I also felt he'd been written out of history. And I probably will be talking a little bit about that today. So the book started as a kind of review of the development of his political thinking. But of course, I had to put bits of his life in there, but it doesn't pretend to be a biography. It's an analysis of his political development, if you like.
Well, I think that second point you made there, Phil, is one we really need to talk about whether or not Tom Mann has been written out of history. I think that's really important, because one of the things that struck me when I was reading the book is that it's really interesting to read about his political journey, but actually just reading about that is quite meaningless without seeing that vivid descriptions that you make of all his political activity. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about the dynamic between his activity and his journey.
Yeah, gladly. I mean, I think there's an element where he was written out of history, and there's an element where he wrote himself out of history. And let me explain what I mean. So, for example, Tom Mann wrote his memoirs in 1912 with a very short update in 1923, and made the full political journey to embrace the Russian Revolution and the Communist Party. And I think to an extent, the fact that the autobiography mirrored the first part of his life, but not the second, plus the fact that Marxists don't always get an easy press, sometimes from the left, but normally from the right, meant that people have tended to cut off any study of Tom Mann around the 1920s, very early 20s. So I focused, if anything, my book, its contribution is of his life from 1917 onwards. So that's how he got written out. I think he wrote himself out in the sense that his is a very difficult biography to write. Tom Mann led the life of an agitator. And he's like one of those political icebergs. Around the time, say, of the Royal Commission of Labour or the Great Dock Strike, we know quite a lot about him. But in other times, he was always working behind the scenes. He was working often in a code. He was often working in a way that had to hide his tactics, if not his strategy, from the employers, whilst making it visible to the mass of workers. And so you get a Tom Mann who leads a life, certainly after 1923, 24, that has a large secretive side to him, especially as he goes on to work for the Red International of Labour Unions and possibly the Comintern as well. I mean, there are certain things about Tom that you won't be able to resolve, in my view, because of that agitator's life. So, for example, during the general strike in 1926, there are some offhand comments about him staying in a hotel near Charing Cross, when in fact we know he was in Moscow and Berlin. And he was probably a second stage of leadership of the Communist Party, because the first ranks had been arrested in anticipation of the general strike. So that's the kind of existence that he had. And there are other times where we don't know what he's doing, and we won't know what he's doing because he never wanted us to. And I think that that's probably something that others might have to follow up in more detail. I doubt they'd get much of a chance to be able to find out exactly what he was doing at different times. I mean, the final one is that in 1938, Harry Pollitt announced that Tom Mann had been elected to the central executive of the Communist Party, when it's probably pretty clear he was a member of a shadow executive committee, which involved Comintern organisers and very well-placed people in the labour movement. He'd probably been doing a role like that for about 20 years. So, you know, there are always shadows. So that's why I would say he was written out because people didn't want to associate him with communism. And he wrote himself out because of the life that he led.
That is a really fascinating part of the book as well, Phil. When like I say, when you're following his political journey, and actually, I want to ask about one aspect of his journey because I think it's really relevant to today, and that is his movement through the ideas and notions of syndicalism into the organisation of the working class in a different form. And I notice in particular, you know, he does talk about Parliament being of no use to the working class in terms of just being a place to record votes, but wants to put the emphasis back on activity and on action. And I think that's really relevant today when we saw the General Secretary of Unite almost try to justify not attending a Labour Party conference through syndicalism, but then reading about how Tom had moved from that perspective onto the next stage of his journey. What do you think about that, and how does that fit with what we're going through today?
Well, I think it does. I think that Tom Mann has an awful lot to say to our new generation of activists. And I also think that his approach to syndicalism has much deeper roots than people think. So as does his attitude to Parliament, which changed quite regularly. I mean, syndicalism is a relatively short space of time in labour movement history, but well underestimated in terms of the long-term influence that it had on the structure and the way that workers fought, usually associated with the Great Unrest. But for Mann, the roots of British syndicalism went back to the labour movement of the 1830s and the 1840s. And he was very much influenced by Robert Owen. And of course, people don't realise what happened to some parts of syndicalism where it caved into the First World War and some of its best known adherents became leading fascists. But for Tom Mann, there was a kind of continuum, which was to do with rank and file self-organisation, that the mass had to be participating in the leadership of the struggle and the structures had to allow that voice in. That the strength of the working class was in the workshop or the place of work. He had this long list in all his speeches: the mines, the mills, the factories, the ports. He went on, to which we would now add the call centres, the universities, etc. So Tom drew these points from, say, the 1880s into syndicalism. And I would argue, in fact, I argue strongly in the book, that he didn't ever abandon those, and that when he became a communist, he brought a lot of the syndicalism and the actual syndicalists as well in with him. So yeah, that's a kind of, Tom Mann is associated with unity, solidarity, and internationalism. And you have to see things like, I think you have to see things like the Parliament question in that context. To him, it was a tactical issue. I mean, he came very close to getting elected to Parliament. He missed by about 150 votes in Aberdeen. At other times, he said it's completely useless. Don't bother with it. But what he thought was that the focus had to be on building the power of the working class. If you did that, then you would be able to have your boot on the neck of Parliament. And so that's kind of how he developed. The unity, the solidarity, he drew from a religious background. And this idea of everybody being in the tent, he drew from his religious background. And it's a very positive aspect that he maintained that. And I think that plus this kind of workplace organisation, plus internationalism, which I think in your book comes out so powerfully, in his day was physically supporting strikes abroad and having our strikes supported from abroad, which of course would now be illegal. But certainly bringing ideas from abroad. Some large parts of syndicalism, for example, came from the French experience and his negative experience of labour movement organising in Australia and New Zealand. So that's Tom Mann. It's workplace, it's workers, it's wherever possible, one union per industry. It's building up the intellectual density of that working class and then engaging with employers if necessary, and running through it a united working class, striking together. He was a great proponent of the use of generalised strikes and the general strike, and probably experienced more than any other trade unionist we've ever known, plus internationalism. And he had these very powerful links with all the leaders of the working class movement in America, in South Africa, in Australia. It's absolutely bewildering, and across the continent. So a lot of his correspondence with those leaders doesn't exist. So we only know people like Sen Katayama, John Jaray. This was done by association. But these were leading syndicalists in their own right, in their own countries.
I think one of the things that I really want to say to anybody who's not had the chance to read the book yet is how exciting the book is. And it is on the basis that, actually Tom was the first global organizer. In a day when getting around the world was nothing like as straightforward as it is now, with weeks and weeks of journeys and all kinds of restrictions. So, I would like to emphasize that there is that sort of sense of excitement in the book as well about what Tom was doing. And I have to ask you this next question, Phil. You have to forgive me. Living in Liverpool, it wouldn't be right if I didn't ask you about the 1911 transport strike, because one of the best known photographs in Liverpool is of Tom Mann speaking at St George's Hall steps during that strike. And of course, the story about the Don't Shoot leaflet that was given out to the troops. Would you like, on behalf of everybody in Liverpool, to just tell us a little bit about that episode in Tom's life?
Yeah, well, it hasn't been the best football season in Liverpool, so I do this in an act of trying to pick up the spirit of solidarity. Now, Tom came to Liverpool already as an acknowledged strike leader, and one of the things about Tom Mann is he never imposed himself from the outside. He invariably got the call, and labour movements like the South African one got to a level where they needed that extra bit of experience and wisdom. And that's what happened in Liverpool, where, of course, he had very long-term contacts and very well rehearsed experience of the structure of the docks. So he arrived and formed the United Strike Council, which was kind of not straightforward. Some of those unions had voted against strikes, but he said everybody had to be in and talking together. And I think one of the things about Tom, you're right, it's a swashbuckling life. There's no other way to describe it. During the dock strike, he carried a revolver on each side, and he used them and was regularly in having problems. And when he reached Liverpool, one of the things that's moved, that kind of no longer in our movement, but was core in those days, was how to deal with strike breakers. And he understood where these people came from, the desperation. Often they were imported from abroad using lies, and were told they were just going to work and never realised they were strike breakers. Although they must have had a clue, because their wages were always a lot better than the guys that were out on strike. But they tried to bring in strike breakers throughout the strike in Liverpool. And he would regularly address them and talk to them and go in amongst them and speak to them and share their problems. And the way that he resolved some of the disputes also had to deal with the strike breakers' issues, whether or not they were left working alongside people who'd been on strike, whether they were paid off and sent away. So you've got the United Strike Council, and then another aspect of Tom was this kind of theatrical side. I don't know if people know this, but he would regularly perform. So his partner, Elsie, would be singing, and Tom would give a lecture about Tom Paine, and then he would do this feet on the table imitation of the capitalist, whilst all the audience were working their fingers to the bone. And he always opted for street theatre. So he used it in 1889 with the famous marches of the docking communities into the city, which played a key role in changing public opinion about the strikes. And he did it again when he went to Liverpool, and there were some big strikes. The Churchill sent the gunboat up the Mersey famously, There were thousands of soldiers who effectively occupied the city, and they did kill 2 strikers, or the 2 men associated with the strikes. No one was ever found guilty of that. During that time, Tom published his journal, The Industrial Syndicalist, and included in it a copy of a leaflet that had been used in a previous dispute, which said, "Don't strike, don't shoot." And it addressed, in the same way as he would address strikebreakers as members of the working class, he addressed soldiers as uniformed members of the working class. And he said that they should not get involved in the dispute, and that they should, well, he never said turn your guns round, but the implication was that they should put the guns down and refuse to be deployed. This, of course, put the fear of God in the authorities. So once the main disputes and the transport workers' strike that flowed out of Merseyside came to an end, he came back down to London, and the Home Secretary decided to prosecute. And Tom, being Tom, absolutely refused to step back. He had published it. He stood by every word. So they arrested the printers, the publishers of the journal, and him as the editor. But then they had the problem of how to get him to the prison once he'd been found guilty. And he was in London, and apparently he was on the train heading north to Strangeways prison when the train stopped several stations early. And in fact, the police turned up in a taxi, and they were so scared of the crowd that had assembled outside the prison that he was driven in through the back way, the tradesman's entrance, in a cab. He said he'd never been to prison in a cab before, and that didn't happen too often because he was often in the prison. So that is, but I think from our point of view, we've got locked into this organising culture as if that's the be all and the end all. The lesson of Tom Mann was that you're organising for a reason. And in Liverpool, whether by design or a combination of design and good fortune and circumstance, he ended up virtually running the city. They called him the dictator of Merseyside because it was the United Strike Council that was issuing vouchers. So people didn't get milk. They didn't get to eat unless the strike committee had said, yeah, if that's going to feed working class communities, it's okay for it to go out. And so the unions became, for a short period of time, effectively the commune, the government of Merseyside. And I think that put the fear of God into Labour politicians, Conservative and Liberal politicians, and the state. But it showed that there's a lot more to organising. We have to say, what are we organising for? Once you've accumulated that power, what do you do with it? And that's one of those periods where, in British history, we went forward, into new areas. It had never been done really before.
I think that is so vivid as part of Tom's message, and you bring it out so firmly in the book, Phil, which is what we're organising for. And that question is really, really at the heart of what's happening now, because there is this assumption that organising is, it's kind of like food. Everybody wants it, but we don't really know what we're doing with it. And I think that dynamic between his political journey and his really exciting, I love the word swashbuckling activity, is so strong in the book. It's like an action thriller and a political journey as well, and I really want to recommend it to everybody.
Can I just say there, Nigel?
Yeah.
I mean, he says unions are not simply about raising wages. The aim of unions is the perfection of human nature and insistence on the right of culture for all instead of for the few, and teaching men to appreciate the refinements of life. They should become centres of enlightenment and not merely the meeting place for paying contributions. And then finally, without trade unions, no living wage or shortening of the hours of labour can be expected. By this struggle, however, the exploitation of labour will only be lessened, not abolished. The exploitation of labour can only be done away with entirely when society has taken control of all the means of production, including the land and the means of distribution. And one of my arguments is that these days, people go to talk to groups of workers about the union, and they talk about the union, but they shouldn't be talking about the union. They should be talking about the kind of life we want and we need, we deserve, that's in our interests. And Tom Mann would go to, there's a famous episode that he writes about in his book where he gets a little telegram. There's a strike in such and such dock in the East End. So he puts his coat on. He says, I will go down and hear the case of the men. And he sits in this meeting, and he said these huge guys are there, sort of towering over him. And one of them comes up and says, you're Tom Mann, aren't you? And he says, I am. State your case. He goes, well, I was listening to you over at such and such marshes when you were speaking last Sunday. And you said we only get half of what we're really worth from the capitalists. So we've decided to stop work for the other half. So what's happening is that we go to people and we go, yeah, join the union, you get good insurance, and if you organise together, you might get but people want to talk about how life can be better and different. And this is the strength of Tom Mann. If you read, I've been able to publish some of his speeches at the Broken Hill strike of coal miners in Australia. I don't think they've been put in a book before. They were dug up for me by a friend who's a researcher for the New South Wales unions. And he is not talking about pounds, shillings and pence there. He's talking about the union, the solidarity, the unity, the internationalism as the kernel of a new life, a new way of running society. So I think that that's a very important factor. Yeah, he didn't limit his trade unionism to pounds, shillings and pence.
Phil, one thing I did want to ask you about, which I think people will be interested in, is can you tell us a little bit about how the process was for you in terms of writing this book and producing it and seeing it as it is, as a finished piece of work?
It was hell. There's no other way to describe it. My other books, the first was about unemployment between the wars. The second was about the political thinking of William Morris. The third was about historical revisionism. But this was my first biography. So I had to read very far and wide first, and quite randomly in some cases. It wasn't all political for a start. And to acquire some of the skill set, you'll be the judge of whether I've managed it or not, as to how to write the biography. I mean, the thing is that you are very privileged with a biography. You do get an insight into somebody else's life, but you have to remember all the time that you're writing about their life, not yours. And you cannot put words into their mouth, not that I would want to. So what I decided to do was to only work around Mann's published speeches. So that, for example, there are no footnotes there to make it much easier for people to read, but everything is in published form in his pamphlets or his speeches. So never to put words in his mouth. And I think the thing that we're really blessed with is that Harry Pollitt, the communist leader, said this about Tom Mann, was that he kind of is the march of the history of the modern labour movement. And they're so closely associated that by looking at Mann's development, you're also looking at how the labour movement developed. I'm very careful not to project too far, but I do make a couple of assertions. So one of them is that Mine is just one of many books about Tom Mann, and I really welcome that. People can look at the same subject matter as me and make different conclusions, or they can look at different aspects of his life. And it's important that we can have a developed, rounded view of Tom Mann. The only two things that I think I do that are particularly original and will really interest people is that I refer to Mann as a pioneer. I don't think anybody else really does that. And I also go beyond 1917 in quite a lot of detail, in particular his organizing work in China, that I think people are going to be absolutely fixated by. I've got a lot of friends that are senior union officials, but the idea of any one of them giving up everything and going to China, working clandestinely for 6 months with no expense account, no coffee machine, nobody to run errands, is just extraordinary. And he did it at the very top of his life. So, you have got a very interesting person. He started out with Christianity. He moved on to social democracy. He moved on to syndicalism. He moved on to Marxism. But he never forgot the qualities of all the previous things. So you end up with a very rich class approach to politics and great respect for historical antecedents. So the first thing Tom Mann did when he went to Canada was he asked to be taken to the grave of George Lovelace, one of the Tolpuddle martyrs. When he was in South Wales with Harry Pollitt and managed to escape prison yet again, he went to the grave of Robert Owen. So he understood his history. And I think that he had, compared to the modern leadership of the Labour movement, so many tricks and so many ways of wrong-footing the employers. And he used the word that you would never hear these days, but his strategy was to hurt them. These people were doing the lives of the people that he represented. And he said, which I think, again, you wouldn't hear these days, "We do not advise violence, but we do not dodge it. After all, what we are engaged in is war. Capital does not hesitate to underpay and overwork us or risk our lives in bad factories. Why should we hesitate to lay our hand to any weapon that would wound capital?" Now, to the comrades who are in the leadership of unions these days, who are worried about, shall we say, who think that we need to limit the aims of the labour movement in order to make it more broadly acceptable, I would say to you that Tom Mann didn't pull his punches on anything, but in particular, this vision of the new world. And it turned out to be very popular. He talked to some massive audiences. The Times records him marching at the head of 40,000 dockers in Shanghai. He went to Madison Square Gardens, where he talked to 20,000 people. And he had this remarkable voice as well, which is one of the things that everybody talks about, because he cut his teeth before the telephone, before the television, before the tape recorder, before the megaphone. But he would hold people for hours on end, and could talk about such a broad range of subjects. What we've got is a very special character. E.P. Thompson described William Morris as one who is above the labour movement, not in a dominating way, but is somebody that anyone can go to, anyone can refer to, without any sectarianism or factionalism, and have a genuine dialogue and an answer. And so I put Tom Mann up there with Robert Owen, with William Morris, with Eleanor Marx, as one that made a very special lifelong contribution. I'm hoping that new generation of activists won't see it as just a history book, but as something that they can draw on from their own experiences and gather that wisdom to make them more effective in pursuit of the class struggle.
Thank you, Phil. You know, that I think that last word is the best place to finish. Yours for the Revolution, the life of an extraordinary man, but an extraordinary book as well. I guarantee all comrades, brothers and sisters, will thoroughly enjoy reading it and learn something like we all should. Thanks for that, Phil. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you.
So, what I would like to remind everybody is this is a book tour that is being sponsored by manifestopress.co. And we have already presented Phil's great book and also my book at the Marx Memorial Library underneath the portrait of Tom Mann, actually. We've spoken at the RMT National Union Conference, we're at Unison meetings, at Trades Council meetings, and in the coming weeks we have invitations to speak at the Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival in Liverpool, which I think will be a great occasion for the Tom Mann fans. But also at various union and other conference meetings, including the Working Class Movement Library in Manchester. So contact manifestopress.co for more information on where you can catch up with Phil and I talking about both our books. And the person who has the dubious privilege of interviewing both Phil and I about our books is Lucy Burke. Lucy is a leading activist inside the University College Lecturers Union, UCU. She's a member of their Higher Education National Executive and a lead negotiator, as well as a leading branch officer at Manchester Metropolitan University. Lucy's a long-time activist inside the labour movement, and it's a great privilege for Phil and I to be able to be interviewed by Lucy about this book. She will be on the book tour with us. So again, I urge you, manifestopress.co. Get on the Twitter account, get on the website, contact us, and keep in touch with what's going on. Have a look also at the book sales that are currently taking place with heavy discounts for books on many important elements of the working class movement and current issues. I now want to hand over to Phil. Phil's going to do the second part of this podcast. And hopefully you're still with us, and hopefully you'll be still with us by the end. Over to you, Phil.